I didn't know that being late could follow me for the rest of my life. That day started like any other. Same school hallways, same tired faces on the bus, same routine I had followed 100 times before. Nothing felt unusual, nothing felt wrong. If someone had told me that by the end of the day I would question fairness, authority, and my own worth, I wouldn't have believed them. I was just a kid trying to get home. The bus stopped suddenly, somewhere we weren't supposed to stop. At first, no one panicked. Kids laughed, complained, leaned their heads against the windows. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Eventually, a teacher came out and told us the bus had broken down. We would have to wait. Waiting didn't scare me. Being late didn't scare me. I had no idea it should have. When we finally arrived home, the sky was already changing color. I remember noticing that because it felt strange. We were never home this late. My stepbrother walked ahead of me, his backpack slung over one shoulder, already nervous. I followed him, quiet, trying to stay invisible. The front door opened, and the house greeted us with silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind that presses against your chest. We stepped inside. Shoes came off. Bags dropped. No one said hello. No one asked how school was. The air felt heavy, like something had been waiting for us. Then the questions came. Why are you late? My stepbrother tried to explain. He talked about the bus, the breakdown, the waiting. He sounded defensive, like he already knew the explanation wouldn't matter. I stood next to him, listening. I wasn't nervous yet. I hadn't done anything wrong. That thought gave me comfort, at first. The response was immediate. My stepbrother was told he was grounded. No discussion, no interest in the explanation, just a decision delivered calmly and firmly. I remember thinking, okay, that's his problem. Not because I thought it was fair, but because it wasn't mine. Then something shifted. The attention moved, slowly, deliberately, toward me. I felt it before I understood it. My name was said. Not loudly, not angrily, just said. I looked up, confused. I waited for someone to laugh, to say there'd been a mistake, to correct themselves. No one did. I remember my mouth opening slightly, like I was about to ask a question. The question was simple. Why me? But the words never came out, because something in the room told me not to speak. I was told I was included. Included. As if punishment was a group activity, as if fairness didn't require accuracy, as if being present was reason enough. I didn't understand it. I still don't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't broken a rule. I hadn't argued. I hadn't done anything except walk through the same door at the same time. But that was enough. I stood there, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I tried to make sense of it. I searched for something I had missed, some rule I had unknowingly broken. Nothing came. And that scared me more than if I had done something wrong. Because if you can't identify your mistake, you can't fix it. You can only accept it. I wanted to say something. I wanted to explain that I had no control over the bus, that I had done exactly what I was supposed to do. But I didn't. Because I had learned, long before that day, that speaking up rarely helped. Speaking up was seen as disrespect. Questioning was seen as defiance. Silence was safer. So I stayed quiet. My stepbrother looked at me, confused too. I could see it in his eyes. Even he didn't understand why I was being dragged into this. But he didn't say anything either. No one did. That moment taught me something important. Not all punishments are about behavior. Some are about power. From that point on, nothing felt clear anymore. The room felt smaller. My body felt stiff, like I was bracing for something I couldn't see coming. I followed instructions without really hearing them. My thoughts were louder than any voice in the room. This isn't fair. Why am I here? Did I miss something? But those thoughts stayed inside me, trapped. Later that night, alone, I replayed everything again and again. I tried to find the logic. I tried to understand how one person's mistake had become my responsibility. I didn't find an answer. What I found instead was doubt. Doubt about whether fairness actually existed. Doubt about whether innocence mattered. Doubt about whether being quiet protected you or made you invisible. That night, something changed in me. I didn't cry. I didn't lash out. I didn't make a scene. I withdrew. I became more careful, more watchful, more aware of how easily the rules could shift without warning. If I could be punished for something I didn't do, then I could never really be safe. That realization settled deep. From that day on, I started measuring my behavior differently. Not just what I did, but where I stood, who I stood next to, when I arrived, when I spoke. I learned that proximity to trouble could be just as dangerous as causing it. And I learned something else, too. When adults make unfair decisions, they rarely explain them. They expect acceptance. And that expectation teaches you to swallow confusion instead of confronting it. I didn't know it then, but that moment would shape how I responded to authority for years, how I handled blame, how easily I accepted responsibility for things that weren't mine. All because of one afternoon, one broken bus, one decision that didn't make sense, and one lesson I never should have had to learn. Sometimes, it doesn't matter what you did. What matters is who has the power and who stays silent. That night didn't end when everyone went to their rooms. It followed me. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. Doors closing, footsteps fading, someone turning off a light. Everything felt normal on the surface, but inside me, nothing was settled. I kept replaying the moment my name was said, not shouted, not accused, just spoken, calmly, like it belonged there. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal, that maybe this was just how things worked in our house, that maybe I was overreacting. But my chest felt tight, and no matter how I turned, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the bus, how it stopped, how we waited, how none of us could do anything about it. I remembered how powerless I felt sitting there, watching time pass, knowing we were getting later and later. I had worried about getting in trouble then, but only for being late, not for being blamed. I wondered if things would have been different if I'd arrived alone. If my stepbrother had walked through that door without me, would I have been invisible, or was my presence just convenient? That question stayed with me. The next morning, I woke up early, earlier than usual. My body felt stiff, like I had slept without ever fully resting. I got dressed quietly, careful not to make noise, like noise itself might attract attention. At the breakfast table, everything looked the same. Same plates, same routine, same calm faces. No one mentioned the night before. No one explained anything. That hurt more than I expected, because silence has a way of telling you that your confusion doesn't matter. My stepbrother sat across from me, eyes down, barely touching his food. I wanted to look at him, to say something, anything, but I didn't know what words were allowed. So we ate in silence. On the walk to the bus stop, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I stopped walking. "For what?" I asked. "For everything," he said, not meeting my eyes. That's when it hit me. Even he thought this was his fault. Even he believed that somehow I was collateral damage, a side effect, an acceptable loss. I didn't know what to say to that either. So I nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting I didn't understand. At school, I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. Every time a teacher corrected someone, my body tensed. Every time someone raised their voice, my stomach dropped. I wasn't scared of being punished at school. I was scared of being blamed. That fear felt different. It was quieter, sharper, like walking on ice you didn't know was thin. All day I kept my head down. I didn't joke. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't take risks. I became careful in a way I hadn't been before. Careful not to stand out. Careful not to be noticed. Careful not to be connected to someone else's mistake. When I got home that afternoon, I paused before opening the door. I don't know why. I just needed a second, a breath, a moment where I wasn't inside yet. Nothing bad happened that evening. No lectures, no consequences. Everything moved on. And that somehow made it worse, because it meant what happened wasn't a reaction. It was a choice. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns, not just in punishments, but in how decisions were made. If something went wrong, fairness wasn't the goal. Control was. Order was. Making an example was. Sometimes that example wasn't accurate. Sometimes it wasn't logical. But it was final. I learned to watch carefully, to read faces, to sense shifts in mood, to anticipate outcomes before they happened. I learned that explanations didn't protect you. Silence did. I stopped asking questions, even harmless ones. Why this rule? Why now? Why me? Those questions stayed locked inside my head, because I'd learned something important that day. Being right doesn't always help. Being quiet does. My stepbrother and I drifted after that, not because we were angry, but because we were both carrying something we didn't know how to talk about. He carried guilt. I carried confusion. Neither of us was given language for what happened, so it turned into distance. At night, I'd lie in bed thinking about how easily the situation could have gone differently. How one question, one adult asking, "Did you have anything to do with this?" could have changed everything. But that question never came. And that absence taught me something too. Sometimes no one checks. Sometimes innocence isn't investigated. It's assumed irrelevant. I started thinking about all the other times I'd been blamed for things I didn't do. Little moments, passing comments, raised eyebrows, quick assumptions. They hadn't bothered me before. Now they did. Because now I knew how quickly blame could stick. I became more distant at home. Not rebellious, not rude, just quieter. I stayed in my room more. I kept my thoughts to myself. I did what I was told without comment. From the outside, I probably looked more obedient than ever. Inside, I was shrinking. I didn't know how to explain that something had changed. I didn't know how to say that I didn't feel safe in the way I used to. So I didn't. And that silence slowly taught me something dangerous. It taught me that injustice wasn't something you confronted. It was something you endured. That belief settled in deep, and it would follow me far beyond that house. By the time a few months had passed, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't angry anymore. I thought anger would come first. I thought I'd feel outrage or resentment, or at least some clear emotion I could recognize. But anger never arrived. What replaced it was something quieter and more permanent. Caution. I started living as if every moment needed to be managed. Every interaction felt like it had invisible consequences attached to it. I paid attention to where I stood in a room, who I stood near, and what I said, even when no one seemed to be listening. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness, the kind that keeps you alert even when nothing is happening. At home, I noticed how easily responsibility shifted, how quickly assumptions were made. If something went missing, eyes moved before questions were asked. If a rule was broken, someone had to pay for it. and accuracy wasn't always important. I learned not to react when my name was mentioned. I learned not to flinch. Flinching made you noticeable. My stepbrother and I barely talked about that day anymore. It lived between us like an unspoken agreement. We both knew something had crossed a line, but neither of us knew how to describe it. He carried guilt. I carried doubt. Sometimes I wondered if he thought I blamed him. Sometimes I wondered if I should. But blaming him felt pointless. He hadn't chosen what happened any more than I had. Still, distance grew. At school, teachers praised me more than before. They liked how quiet I was, how reliable, how serious. I became the kid who never caused trouble. What they didn't see was how much effort it took to maintain that image. I didn't take chances anymore. I didn't joke too loudly. I didn't stand out. I stayed within invisible boundaries that only I seemed to notice. When group projects were assigned, I volunteered for the background work. When discussions happened, I listened instead of speaking. When opinions were asked for, I kept mine neutral. I had learned that being associated with mistakes, even indirectly, was dangerous. So I stayed neutral. One afternoon, a classmate was blamed for something they hadn't done. The teacher assumed. The class went quiet. The student tried to explain, stumbling over their words. I watched it all happen, and I did nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because something inside me froze. I recognized the moment too well. The confusion, the unfairness, the silence that followed. I told myself it wasn't my place, that speaking up might make things worse, that the teacher wouldn't listen anyway. Those excuses felt familiar. That was the first time I realized the cost of what I'd learned. Not just to me, but to how I treated others. I had learned how to survive injustice by staying quiet, and now that survival instinct was turning into a habit. At home, I became invisible by design. I finished chores early. I stayed in my room. I didn't ask for things. I didn't push limits. I made myself easy to manage. And in return, I was mostly left alone. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt empty. There were nights when I sat on my bed and tried to remember what I used to be like before that day, before the bus broke down, before blame became something that could land anywhere. I remembered laughing more freely, talking without thinking, assuming that being honest was enough. Those memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I wondered if that version of me had been naive, or if this version was just smaller. Sometimes, when no one was home, I stood in the living room and looked around. The same walls, the same furniture, the same routines. Nothing had changed, except me. I realized that what hurt most wasn't the punishment itself. It was the lack of acknowledgement. No one ever said, "You didn't deserve that." No one ever said, "We made a mistake." No one ever explained why I was included at all. The moment had been erased, as if it never happened. But it had happened. It lived in how I hesitated before speaking, in how I apologized automatically, in how I assumed fault before anyone accused me. I started noticing it in other areas of my life. When friends were upset, I assumed I'd done something wrong, even when I hadn't. When someone was quiet, I felt responsible for fixing it. When authority figures were displeased, I internalized it immediately. I was always searching for the thing I'd done wrong, even when there was nothing to find. One evening, my stepbrother knocked on my door. He didn't come in right away. He just stood there. I still think about that day. I looked at him surprised. "I don't think it was fair," he added. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said that out loud before. Not in this house. Not to me. "I know," I said quietly. We stood there for a moment, unsure what to do with the honesty. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the past. But it mattered, because it was the first time someone acknowledged what I had felt. That night, lying in bed, I realized how much I had been waiting for permission to feel wronged,
how much I had needed someone else to say it before I allowed myself to believe it. That realization was unsettling. Why did I need permission to feel hurt? Why had I learned to doubt my own experience? The answer scared me, because it meant that what happened that day wasn't isolated. It was part of something bigger, a system where authority mattered more than fairness, where explanations were optional, where silence was expected. And I had adapted to it perfectly. Too perfectly. I didn't know how to change yet. I didn't know how to speak up without fear. But for the first time, I understood that what I'd learned wasn't strength. It was survival. And survival, when it lasts too long, starts to look like identity. That thought stayed with me, and slowly, it began to push back.
Once that thought settled in my mind that I had learned survival instead of strength, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It followed me everywhere. I noticed it in small moments first. Moments that used to pass without meaning now felt heavier. When someone asked me a simple question and I paused too long before answering. When I rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking, just in case I said the wrong thing. When I chose silence, even when I had something important to say. None of this felt dramatic. It felt normal. And that scared me. I started paying attention to my body, how tense my shoulders always were, how shallow my breathing became when someone sounded disappointed, how quickly my heart raced when I felt misunderstood. I wasn't reacting to what was happening. I was reacting to what might happen. At home, I kept doing everything right. I stayed out of trouble. I followed rules without complaint. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside, I had begun to separate. There was the version of me that existed outwardly, the quiet, reliable one, and there was the version of me that stayed hidden, the one who constantly questioned himself, who replayed situations over and over, searching for mistakes that might not exist. That second version never felt safe enough to come out. Sometimes I caught myself imagining what would have happened if I had spoken up that day, if I had said, I didn't do anything wrong, if I had asked why I was being included. In those imagined versions, things always went badly. The room grew colder, voices grew firmer, consequences escalated. Whether or not that would have been true didn't matter. My mind had already decided that silence was the safer option. That belief shaped everything. I avoided conflict, even healthy conflict. I let people misunderstand me because correcting them felt risky. I allowed others to take credit for my work because speaking up felt like attention, and attention felt dangerous. I wasn't trying to disappear. I just didn't know how to exist any other way. One afternoon, a teacher pulled me aside after class. Nothing serious, just a conversation about future plans, goals, potential. You're capable, they said, but you hold back. I smiled politely and nodded. They had no idea how accurate that was. Later that evening, I sat alone in my room and stared at the wall, thinking about that sentence. You hold back. I did. Not because I lacked confidence, but because confidence had once led me into a situation I couldn't control. I had trusted fairness, and fairness hadn't shown up. That realization hardened into something else over time. Distrust. Not loud distrust, not anger. Quiet distrust. The kind that makes you observe instead of engage. The kind that keeps you prepared for disappointment even when none is visible. I watched adults closely, how quickly they assumed, how rarely they apologized, how often they confused authority with being right. I didn't hate them, but I stopped believing they were always fair. And that belief changed how I saw the world. I noticed injustice everywhere, in small comments, in quick judgments, in situations where someone was blamed simply because they were convenient. Before, I might have ignored those moments. Now, I felt them. But I still didn't act, because knowing something is wrong doesn't automatically give you the courage to confront it. One night, I overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for me. Someone was talking about discipline, about how kids needed to learn lessons. about how sometimes you had to be tough. I stood there quietly, listening, and for the first time I felt something rise in me. Not fear, not guilt, anger. It wasn't explosive, it didn't make me shake. It was steady, controlled, and it felt unfamiliar. I realized that anger wasn't always dangerous, that anger could exist without punishment following it, that anger could be information. That was a new idea. I carried it with me carefully, like something fragile. I didn't act on it right away. I didn't confront anyone, but I stopped pushing it away. I let myself feel it, and with it came clarity. I began to understand that what happened that day wasn't about rules or behavior. It was about convenience. I was there, I was quiet, I didn't fight back, so I was included. That realization hurt, but it also freed something in me. Because if it wasn't my fault, then I didn't need to carry the shame anymore. I started testing that idea in small ways. I corrected someone gently when they misunderstood me. I said no without explaining myself. I allowed myself to feel upset without immediately blaming myself. Each time I waited for consequences. They didn't come. That confused me at first, then it empowered me. I realized that the world outside that house didn't operate by the same rules I had internalized. Authority wasn't always absolute. Mistakes weren't always punished. And speaking up didn't always lead to harm. That understanding grew slowly, unevenly. Some days I felt strong. Other days I slipped back into old habits, apologizing too quickly, staying quiet too long. Healing wasn't linear, but it was happening. One evening, my stepbrother and I talked again, not about that day directly, but about growing up, about fairness, about how certain things stay with you longer than you expect. He said, "I think about it sometimes, how different things could have been." I nodded. "So do I said. That was all, but that was enough, because we both knew what we were talking about, and for the first time I didn't feel alone in it. That night, lying in bed, I realized something important. The most damaging part of what happened wasn't the punishment, it was the lesson I learned afterwards. That silence keeps you safe, that fairness is optional, that power doesn't need to explain itself. Unlearning those lessons would take time, but now I knew they weren't truths. They were adaptations, and adaptations can be changed. I wasn't there yet, but I was closer. I didn't change all at once. There was no moment where I suddenly became confident, outspoken, or fearless. What happened to me didn't heal in a single conversation or a single realization. It softened slowly, the way scars do, still there, but no longer controlling how I moved. For a long time, I carried what happened like a quiet rule book inside my head. Don't stand out, don't question decisions, don't assume fairness will protect you. Those rules had kept me safe once, or at least they had kept me unnoticed. But as I grew older, they started to cost me more than they protected me. I noticed it most in relationships. I avoided conflict at all costs. If someone was upset, I immediately assumed it was my fault. If someone misunderstood me, I let it happen rather than correct them. I became the person who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. People liked me for that. They called me easygoing, understanding, mature. What they didn't see was how much I was giving up to stay that way. There were moments when I wanted to speak, really speak, but something stopped me. A familiar pressure in my chest. A quiet warning that said, "This won't end well." That warning wasn't coming from the present. It was coming from that day. The day I learned that being innocent didn't guarantee protection. For years, I didn't talk about it. Not because I had forgotten, but because I had normalized it. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that other people had it worse, that it was pointless to dwell on something that couldn't be changed. But buried experiences don't disappear. They shape how you see yourself. They shape what you accept. The turning point didn't come from confrontation. It came from exhaustion. One day I realized how tired I was of carrying responsibility that wasn't mine, of apologizing for things I hadn't done, of shrinking to make situations easier for everyone else. I was tired of being careful all the time. That exhaustion forced honesty, not with anyone else, with myself. I admitted something I had avoided for years. What happened to me was unfair. Saying that didn't make me angry, it made me lighter, because fairness didn't need to be proven, it only needed to be acknowledged. Once I allowed myself to see that truth, I started making small changes. I spoke up when something felt wrong. I asked questions instead of assuming silence was expected. I stopped immediately blaming myself when things went wrong. At first, it felt uncomfortable, unnatural, like I was breaking rules I'd lived by for years. But nothing terrible happened. No punishment followed, no explosion. The world didn't collapse. That was the moment I understood how deeply that one experience had shaped my expectations. I had been living as if fairness was fragile and authority was untouchable. But outside that house, life worked differently. People listened. Mistakes were discussed. Explanations mattered. That realization didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had failed a test I didn't understand. I started seeing myself as someone who had adapted to an environment that didn't make room for fairness. That shift changed everything. I became more selective about where I stayed silent, more aware of when silence was a choice and when it was fear. I learned to tell the difference. I still value calm. I still value peace. But I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. The memory of that day hasn't vanished. It still surfaces sometimes, unexpectedly. A delayed train, a misunderstood situation, a moment where blame feels close. But now, when that old instinct rises, I pause. I remind myself that I don't need to carry what isn't mine, that responsibility doesn't automatically belong to the quiet one, that fairness is worth questioning. I think about the kid I was back then, standing there, confused, trying to understand how someone else's mistake had become his burden. I wish I could tell him this: you didn't do anything wrong. You weren't invisible, you were overlooked, and that says more about the situation than it ever did about you. What happened to me shaped me, but it didn't define me. I learned caution early, but I also learned resilience. And now I'm learning something even harder: how to trust my own voice. Telling the story isn't about blame, it's about truth. Because stories like this don't end when the moment passes. They end when they're finally spoken. And this is me speaking.